Today we've got 5 absolutely terrifying true stories from people who went camping and came face to face with something they were never supposed to see. And I promise you, every single one of these will make you think twice the next time somebody suggests sleeping in a tent. Story 1. The Visitor at Boundary Waters. In the summer of 2016, a 31-year-old man named Kevin Brower decided to take a solo canoe trip through the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness in northern Minnesota. For those unfamiliar, the Boundary Waters is over 1 million acres of untouched forest, lakes, and rivers that stretches right up to the Canadian border. There are no roads, no cell service, no buildings, no power lines. Once you paddle in, you are completely and totally cut off from the rest of civilization. If something happens to you in the Boundary Waters, nobody is coming to help. Not quickly, anyway. Kevin was an experienced outdoorsman. He'd been making trips to the Boundary Waters every year since he was a teenager, first with his father, then with friends from college, and eventually on his own. He knew how to hang a bear bag. He knew how to read a portage map. He knew how to patch a hull with duct tape and pine sap. He knew that the isolation was the entire point. That's what made the place feel sacred to him. Out there, it was just you and the water and the trees and the birds, and the rest of the world didn't exist. His plan was a 5-day loop. Paddle in through entry point 25 near Moose Lake, work his way north and west through a chain of smaller lakes, and then circle back to his starting point. He'd reserved permits well in advance, packed lightweight dehydrated meals, brought a water filter and iodine tablets as backup, and carried a one-person tent that weighed less than 2 pounds. He had a satellite messenger device clipped to his pack for emergencies, but he'd never once had to use it. Everything was dialed in. The first 2 days were perfect. Clear skies, calm water, no bugs to speak of, which if you've ever been to the Boundary Waters in summer, you know that alone is a small miracle. The mosquitoes up there can be so thick they form visible clouds, but that week, for whatever reason, they were a non-issue. Kevin made camp each night on designated sites, ate his meals watching the sun go down over water so still it looked like glass, and fell asleep to the sound of loons calling across the lake. He saw a bald eagle on the first morning, a family of otters on the second afternoon. It was everything he loved about this place. It was on the third night that things changed. Kevin had paddled hard that day, nearly 14 miles, including 2 portages, one of which was over a quarter mile through dense brush with his canoe on his shoulders. By the time he found a campsite on a small lake called Ogishkamunsi, he was exhausted. His arms were burning. His lower back was stiff. All he wanted was food and sleep. The site was on a narrow point of land that jutted out into the water. Behind him, thick boreal forest, spruce and birch and jack pine so dense you couldn't see more than 20 feet into it. In front, the lake stretched out in every direction. He liked that. It meant he could see anything coming from the water, and nothing was going to sneak up from behind without making serious noise crashing through that brush. He set up his tent on the flattest patch of ground he could find, filtered water from the lake, hung his bear bag on the designated cable strung between 2 trees, and cooked his dinner, some kind of dehydrated chili that tasted better than it had any right to. By 9:30 the sun was getting low, painting the clouds in shades of pink and orange, and Kevin crawled into his sleeping bag. He was asleep within minutes. He woke up at what he estimated was around 2 in the morning. He didn't know why. There was no sound, no wind. The air was dead still, just silence. And that was the problem. Total silence. No frogs, no insects, no loons, nothing. If you've spent any time in the North Woods, you know that the forest at night is never quiet. There's always something. Peepers, crickets, owls, the rustle of small animals. Always. The absence of that sound is unnatural. It means something has frightened every living thing in the area into silence. Kevin lay still and listened. His heart rate was already climbing and he didn't even have a reason yet. It was just instinct. Something deep and old in his brain had identified a threat before his conscious mind could catch up. His body knew before he did. Then he heard it. Footsteps. Not animal footsteps. Not the 4-legged, uneven rhythm of a deer or a moose. Not the light padding of a wolf or a fox. These were two-footed, bipedal, heavy, and they were close, maybe 15 feet from his tent. They were coming from the direction of the tree line, moving slowly, each step placed with care, as if the person was trying to be quiet but couldn't avoid the crunch of pine needles and dry twigs underfoot. Kevin held his breath. In the Boundary Waters, it's not unheard of to have another camper wander into your sight by mistake. People get turned around, especially on lakes with multiple campsites. But it was 2 a.m. There was no reason for anyone to be walking through the woods at that hour. The nearest other campsite was over a mile away by water, and to reach Kevin's site by land, you'd have to bushwhack through some of the thickest forest in the region. Nobody does that during the day, let alone in the middle of the night. And there was no flashlight, no headlamp, no glow of any kind. Whatever was out there was moving in total darkness, and apparently had no problem doing so. That detail is what unsettled Kevin the most. He told this story later on an outdoor forum, and he kept coming back to that point. Whoever this was didn't need light. The footsteps circled his tent, slowly, one full loop. Kevin tracked the sound as it moved from his left side, around the foot of the tent, across to the right side, and then around behind him, to the side facing the tree line. Then they stopped, directly behind him. Kevin could hear breathing, slow, controlled breathing, not labored, not excited, calm, the breathing of someone who was perfectly relaxed. Whatever was out there was standing still, maybe 5 feet from his head, separated only by the thin nylon wall of his tent. Kevin did not move. He did not call out. He did not reach for his flashlight or his knife or his satellite messenger. Every instinct he had told him to stay silent, stay flat, pretend to be asleep. He didn't know what would happen if this person realized he was awake. He didn't want to find out. For the next, and Kevin swears to this, he says he watched the minutes tick by on his watch. 45 minutes. Whoever was standing behind his tent did not move. They just stood there, breathing. Occasionally, Kevin heard what sounded like weight shifting from one foot to the other. A slight creak of a boot sole. But the person never spoke, never touched the tent, never did anything except stand there. 45 minutes. Standing motionless in the pitch dark, inches from a stranger's tent, in the middle of a wilderness that requires a multi-hour paddle just to reach. Kevin said the worst part was not knowing what the person was doing. Were they looking at the tent? Were they looking at something else? Were they deciding something? He lay there running through every possibility, and none of them were good. Then, just as suddenly as it had arrived, the footsteps started again. They moved away from the tent, toward the tree line, slowly at first, then faster. Within a minute, the sound had faded completely into the forest. Within a few minutes after that, the frogs started back up. The insects returned. The loons resumed their calls. The forest came back to life, as if some invisible pressure had been lifted. Kevin did not sleep again that night. He lay rigid in his bag until first light, which at that latitude in summer comes early, around 5:15. The moment there was enough light to see, he unzipped his tent and stepped outside. Everything looked normal. His bear bag was still hanging. His canoe was where he'd left it, pulled up on the rocks. His gear was untouched. But he walked to the spot behind his tent where the visitor had stood, and the ground there was soft, a mix of pine needles and damp earth. And there, clear as day, were boot prints, size 11 or 12, with deep tread marks from heavy-soled hiking boots. Someone had been standing there all right. A person. A real flesh-and-blood person with no light source, no camp of their own, no canoe, no visible means of having gotten to that lake, standing 5 feet from a sleeping stranger at 2 a.m. Kevin took photos of the boot prints with his phone. Then he broke camp in record time. He said he had everything packed and his canoe in the water in less than 15 minutes, which for anyone who's done backcountry camping, you know that's fast. He completed his trip but changed his route, skipping the remote lakes he'd planned to visit and sticking to the larger, more populated waterways. He paddled the remaining 2 days without stopping to camp overnight. He slept in his canoe, pulled up on rocky shores in broad daylight, where he could see in every direction. He reported the incident to the Forest Service when he returned to the entry point. The ranger he spoke to listened carefully, took notes, and told him that in rare cases, people do live illegally in the boundary waters, off the grid, sometimes for months, sometimes for years. People who don't want to be found, people with their own reasons for being out there. The ranger said they'd look into it and ask Kevin to email the photos of the boot prints. Kevin did. He never heard back. He followed up twice. No response. Kevin still goes to the boundary waters, but he doesn't go alone anymore. Story 2. The Wrong Trail in the Smokies. In October of 2019, a couple from Knoxville, Tennessee, Rachel and Tom Desmond, decided to spend a long weekend backpacking in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. The Smokies are the most visited national park in the United States, drawing over 12 million people a year, but most of those visitors stick to the scenic drives and the easy day hikes near the main entrances. The backcountry, the deep interior of the park, is a different world. Once you're a few miles from a trailhead, you can hike for hours without seeing another soul. Rachel and Tom were both in their late 20s, in good shape, and had done this trip before. They knew the trails. They knew the elevation changes. They knew that October in the Smokies can swing from sunny and warm to cold and rainy in the space of an hour. Their plan was to hike to Campsite 37, a backcountry site about 7 miles from the trailhead, situated on the Appalachian Trail at an elevation of about 4,000 feet. They started their hike on a Friday morning. The weather was ideal, mid-50s, overcast, a slight breeze carrying the smell of wet leaves and wood smoke from somewhere far away. The kind of autumn day where the mountains turn into a solid wall of orange and red and gold, and the trail feels like a tunnel carved through color. They made good time, stopping only twice to rest and filter water from a creek. They arrived at Campsite 37 just before 4 in the afternoon. Now, backcountry camping in the Smokies works on a reservation system. You have to book specific sites for specific nights, and the park limits how many people can be at each site at any given time. There's a maximum group size, a maximum number of tents, and you have to hang all your food on bear cables because black bears are everywhere in this park. Rachel had reserved the spot weeks in advance, and when they arrived, they were relieved to see it was empty. They'd have the place to themselves. The campsite itself was pleasant enough, a roughly flat area surrounded by old-growth hardwoods, with a small creek running along the eastern edge. There were the standard bear cables, a few flat spots for tents, and a privy about 100 yards down a side trail. Rachel and Tom set up their tent on the flattest patch of ground near the creek, hung their food bag, cooked dinner over their camp stove, freeze-dried pad thai, which they ate sitting on a fallen log, and settled in for the night. By 8 o'clock the temperature had dropped into the low 40s, and they were zipped into their sleeping bags. Around 11 that night, Rachel was still awake. She was a light sleeper and had never been able to fall asleep easily in a tent. She was reading on her phone with the brightness turned way down, scrolling through a book she'd downloaded before they lost cell service. Tom was sound asleep beside her, breathing deeply. That's when she heard voices. At first, she thought it was other hikers arriving late. It happens more often than you'd think. People underestimate how long the trail takes, especially with full packs, and they end up walking the last few miles in the dark with headlamps. Annoying for people already asleep at the campsite, but not unusual. But as she listened, something about the voices felt wrong. They weren't on the trail. The trail ran along the north side of the campsite, and these voices were coming from the south, from the woods, from the opposite direction, where there was no trail, no path, nothing but dense Appalachian forest running steeply downhill for miles. And the voices weren't getting louder, which meant whoever was talking wasn't walking toward the camp. They were stationary, just standing in the trees, in the dark, talking. Rachel strained to make out the words. There were at least 2 voices, both male, speaking in low, flat tones. No laughter, no variation in pitch, no emotion at all. She couldn't understand what they were saying. Not because of the distance. They were close enough to hear clearly, maybe 30 or 40 yards out. But because the words didn't make sense, it sounded like English. She could catch what seemed like familiar syllables and word shapes. But the sentences were jumbled. The syntax was wrong. It was as if someone had taken normal phrases and rearranged the words into a random order. She described it later as hearing a conversation that had been cut into pieces and glued back together wrong. She woke Tom up. She put her hand over his mouth first. She didn't want him making noise, and then pointed toward the south side of the tent. He listened for a few seconds and his face changed. The sleepy confusion drained away and was replaced by something sharp and alert. He heard it too. Without a word, he reached over and turned off her phone light. They sat in the dark, shoulders pressed together, listening. The voices continued for roughly 10 minutes. The cadence never changed. The volume never changed. It was the same flat, emotionless, scrambled speech delivered at the same low volume, without pause. Then abruptly, the voices stopped. Not a trailing off, a hard stop, as if someone had hit a mute button. Complete silence. Rachel and Tom stayed awake, sitting up in their sleeping bags, barely breathing. Tom had his hand on the handle of the small folding knife he kept in his pack. Rachel had her phone in her hand, the screen dark. They sat there for nearly an hour, waiting, listening. Nothing. Then Rachel noticed something. There was a light in the trees. Not a flashlight. It was too steady, too dim. It didn't bounce the way a flashlight does when someone walks. It was more consistent, unwavering, like a lantern that had been turned down very low, except the color was wrong. A normal lantern puts out warm yellow-orange light. This was pale, almost blue-white, cold, and it was moving. Slowly, threading through the trees in a wide arc around the campsite, staying deep enough in the forest that Rachel couldn't see the source. Just the glow, filtering through the bare branches and the remaining leaves. Tom wanted to call out. He started to sit forward, to unzip the tent. Rachel grabbed his arm hard enough to leave a mark. She showed him the bruise later, and shook her head. She couldn't have explained why in that moment. There was no logical reason not to call out. If these were other campers, calling out would resolve the whole thing. But every nerve in her body was telling her not to make their presence known, not to let whatever was out there know they were watching. Tom looked at her face in the dim light and saw something there that made him stop. He listened to her. The light moved in a complete half circle around their camp, always staying in the trees, always about 50 or 60 yards out. It moved at a walking pace, not fast, not slow, steady, purposeful. It took nearly 20 minutes to complete the arc from the south side of the camp to the north side. Then it stopped, held position for maybe 30 seconds, and went out. Not dimmed, went out. Instantly, like a switch had been flipped. They sat in the dark for the rest of the night. Neither of them spoke above a whisper. Neither of them slept. At first light, about 6:45, they packed their bags in under 10 minutes. Before they left, Tom walked toward the tree line on the south side, in the direction where the voices had come from. Rachel didn't want him to go, but he insisted. He said he needed to know. About 40 yards into the woods, moving carefully down the slope, he found something that made his stomach drop. There was a small clearing, maybe 10 feet across, where the undergrowth had been trampled flat. The leaf litter was pressed down and scattered, as if people had been standing there for a while, shifting their weight, moving in slow circles. In the center of the clearing were the remains of a fire, not a campfire, not the kind you'd cook over or warm your hands at, but something smaller, more contained. A fire that had been built inside a ring of stones no bigger than a dinner plate. The stones were blackened, and inside the ring was a small pile of fine white ash. Around the fire ring, arranged in a rough circle at even intervals, were 7 small piles of stones. Each pile was exactly 5 stones high. Each pile was topped with a tuft of animal hair, dark, coarse, probably from a bear or a wild boar. The arrangement was precise. The spacing was even. Whoever had done this had taken their time. This was not something thrown together on a whim. Tom didn't touch anything. He took 3 photos on his phone, his hand shaking badly enough that the first 2 came out blurred. Then he walked back to Rachel. They hiked out in just over 2 hours, moving faster than either of them had ever moved on a trail with full packs, nearly running on the downhill sections. When they got back to the trailhead, sweating and out of breath, they showed the photos to a park ranger at the station near the parking area. The ranger, an older man, probably in his 50s, looked at the images for a long time. He swiped through them slowly, zoomed in on the stone piles, zoomed in on the fire ring. His expression didn't change, but he was quiet for what felt like a long time. Then he asked them exactly where the campsite was, which direction Tom had walked, and approximately how far into the woods the clearing was. He thanked them, told them they'd done the right thing by not approaching the people in the woods, and said they should head home and enjoy the rest of their weekend. Rachel asked if he knew what the stone piles were. The ranger said he couldn't comment on an ongoing matter. She asked what ongoing matter he was referring to. He said he couldn't comment on that either. Rachel followed up with the Park Service by email the following week. She received a reply 6 days later that said only that the matter had been referred to law enforcement and that they could not provide additional details due to the nature of the investigation. She replied asking for clarification. She never heard anything more. Story 3. The Hands on the Tent. This story comes from a woman named Carla Reeves, who was 26 at the time and living in Flagstaff, Arizona. In the spring of 2018, Carla and 3 of her friends, another woman named Maya, and 2 men, Derek and Sam, drove out to a dispersed camping area in the Coconino National Forest, about 30 miles south of Flagstaff. Dispersed camping means there are no designated sites, no facilities, no fire rings, no picnic tables, no bathrooms, no rangers. You just drive down a forest road until the pavement turns to dirt. Keep going until the dirt turns to ruts and find a spot that looks good. You're on your own in every sense. It's legal on most national forest land, and for people who want real solitude. People who want to be miles from the nearest human being, it's the way to go. Carla and her group had done this a dozen times before, usually on long weekends when the weather cooperated. They had a favorite spot, a flat clearing at the end of a rutted dirt road that dead-ended at the edge of a shallow canyon. The clearing was big enough for 2 tents and a fire ring, with ponderosa pines on 3 sides and the canyon rim on the 4th. You could see the San Francisco peaks from there, the tallest mountains in Arizona, still capped with snow in spring. And at night, the stars were so thick and bright it almost didn't look real. There was no light pollution, no sound pollution, just the wind and the pines and the occasional coyote. The closest paved road was about 4 miles back. The closest town was Flagstaff, 30 miles north. If you screamed at that campsite, absolutely nobody would hear you. They arrived on a Saturday afternoon around 3. The drive-in had been rough. The road was worse than usual from spring runoff, and Derek's truck had bottomed out twice on deep ruts. They set up 2 tents, Carla and Maya in one, Derek and Sam in the other, about 15 feet apart, with the fire ring between them. They gathered wood, built a fire, cooked hot dogs and corn on the cob wrapped in foil, drank some beers, told stories, watched the stars come out. Normal camping night. The kind of night you remember fondly for years. By 11 or so, the fire was dying down. The temperature was dropping into the 30s, and everyone decided to call it. Carla woke up at some point in the middle of the night. She didn't know why at first. No sound had woken her, no dream. She just opened her eyes and was awake. She checked her phone. 3:22 in the morning. She had to use the bathroom, which when you're dispersed, camping means walking a respectable distance from camp with a flashlight and a roll of toilet paper and hoping you don't step on a rattlesnake. She lay there for a few minutes, trying to convince herself she could wait until morning. She couldn't. She unzipped her tent as quietly as possible. Those tent zippers sound deafening in the middle of the night. Slipped on her boots without lacing them, and stepped outside. The fire was completely out. Not even embers. Just a bed of gray ash. The moon was about half full, hanging in the western sky, giving just enough light to see shapes, but not details. The two tents were dark. Derek's truck was a black shape at the edge of the clearing. The ponderosa pines stood tall and still around the perimeter, their silhouettes jagged against the stars. Carla walked about 40 yards from camp, past the tree line, did her business, and started heading back. She was thinking about her sleeping bag, and how cold her feet were going to be when she climbed back in. That's when she saw it. There was someone standing at the edge of the clearing, not in the clearing, at the edge, right where the tree line started, between two tall ponderosas. A person, standing completely still, facing the camp, not moving, not walking toward the camp or away from it, just standing there, watching. Carla froze. She was about 30 yards from the figure and about 40 yards from the tents, which meant she was closer to whoever this was than she was to her friends. She was alone, in the dark, in the middle of a national forest, and there was a stranger between her and her camp. She stood there, not moving, barely breathing, trying to process what she was seeing. The figure was tall, well over 6 feet, and thin, very thin. They were wearing dark clothing, pants, and a long-sleeved shirt or jacket. It was impossible to tell exactly. Carla couldn't make out any features. No face, no hands, no hair color, just a shape. A human shape standing in the tree line, perfectly still, oriented toward the camp where her friends were sleeping. Carla's mind raced through the possibilities. Another camper? There had been no one else on the road. No vehicles at any of the pull-offs they'd passed. A hiker. At 3 in the morning, 30 miles from town, on a road that goes nowhere? Someone from one of the nearby ranches? The nearest ranch was over 10 miles away, and there was no reason for a rancher to be standing in the woods in the dead of night. None of the explanations made sense, and there was something about the stillness of the figure that went beyond a person who had simply stopped walking. This was the stillness of someone who had been standing there for a long time, someone who was content to stand there and watch. Carla made a decision. She would not run. Running meant noise. Running meant drawing attention to herself. She walked, not ran, walked, in a wide arc around the edge of the clearing, keeping as much distance as possible between herself and the figure, moving slowly, placing each foot carefully. She kept her flashlight off. She didn't take her eyes off the figure. It didn't move. She reached her tent. She climbed inside. She woke Maya by putting her hand on Maya's shoulder and squeezing. Maya startled, and Carla covered her mouth. She leaned in close to Maya's ear and whispered what she'd seen. Maya's eyes went wide. She didn't ask questions. She didn't ask if Carla was sure. She looked at Carla's face and immediately started packing her bag. They crawled, literally crawled on their hands and knees, across the short distance to the guy's tent, and woke Derek and Sam the same way. Hands on shoulders, whispered explanations. Sam unzipped the tent door a few inches and looked out toward the tree line where Carla had pointed. He stared for a long time. Then he zipped the door shut and shook his head. Whoever had been standing there was gone. Derek wanted to brush it off, probably just another camper, he said. Someone else dispersed camping nearby who had gotten up to relieve themselves, and Carla had spooked. It was dark, easy to get confused. Sam wasn't so sure. Maya was already packed. Carla was firm. Something about the way the figure was standing, the stillness of it, the way it was facing the camp, the fact that it was 3 in the morning and they were miles from anyone, told her this wasn't a curious neighbor. They argued in whispers for about 5 minutes. Derek said they should go back to sleep. Sam said they should at least stay up and keep watch. Maya said they should leave. Carla said nothing. She was sitting in the corner of the tent with her arms wrapped around her knees, listening. Then Sam shushed everyone. He'd heard something. There was a sound coming from behind their tents, from the direction of the canyon edge, the side of the clearing where the ground dropped away into the shallow ravine. It was a scraping sound, slow, rhythmic, steady, the sound of something hard being dragged across rock. It lasted about 30 seconds, then it stopped. Nobody said anything. The 4 of them sat in that tent, shoulder to shoulder in the cramped space, eyes wide, breathing shallow. The silence stretched out. Then Derek pointed at his tent wall. In the faint moonlight filtering through the nylon, casting just enough glow to see shapes, they could all see it. A handprint, pressed against the outside of the tent from the exterior. A full, spread-fingered handprint, the fingers long and splayed, pressing the fabric inward, creating a clear impression. Then, right next to it, another one. 2 hands, pressed flat against the tent wall, about shoulder-width apart. Someone was standing directly outside the tent, pressing both hands flat against it. Nobody screamed. Nobody breathed. They all stared at those 2 handprints, pushed into the tent fabric, completely motionless. The person outside didn't push harder, didn't try to collapse the tent, didn't grab the fabric, didn't try to find the zipper, didn't say anything. They just held their hands there, pressed flat, as if they were feeling the tent, feeling whether something was inside, feeling the warmth. The hands were big. Carla said later that the fingers seemed too long, but she acknowledges she was terrified, and her perception might not have been reliable. What she is sure of is that whoever was outside stood there with their hands on the tent wall for at least 2 full minutes. 2 minutes of 4 people sitting inches away from a stranger's hands, separated by a 1/4 millimeter of nylon. Then the hands slid down, slowly, not pulled away, slid, dragging down the fabric from about chest height to the ground, leaving a faint trail of pressure on the nylon. Then they pulled away. Footsteps, quiet, unhurried, moving away from the tent, not toward the tree line this time, toward the canyon rim. The sound of feet on dirt, then on rock, then gone. The group did not wait. They did not discuss it. They did not pack carefully. They grabbed what they could carry, sleeping bags, packs, keys, and ran to the car. Derek had the truck started in seconds. They were on the dirt road, bouncing through ruts at a speed that should have blown a tire within 2 minutes. They hit the paved road 15 minutes later and didn't stop until they were in Flagstaff, doing 90 miles an hour on the highway. Nobody talking. The cab of the truck dead silent, except for the engine. They came back the next afternoon with 2 more friends, both of them large men, one of them armed, to collect the rest of their gear. Everything was still there. The tents were standing. The cooler was untouched. The fire ring was cold. Nothing was taken. Nothing was damaged. Nothing was missing. But on the ground around the tents, in the soft red dirt that the monsoon season hadn't yet baked hard, there were footprints. Bare footprints. Long, narrow, deep impressions of human feet with no shoes, no boots, no sandals. Whoever had been out there that night, pressing their hands against the tent, standing at the edge of the clearing in the dark, was barefoot. In the Coconino National Forest, in March, when the nighttime temperatures were in the low 30s. Carla has not been dispersed camping since. She says she still camps, but only at developed campgrounds with other people around. She says she still thinks about those handprints, about the way they slid down the tent wall, about the person who was standing on the other side, close enough to touch, choosing not to come in. She says the thing that still keeps her up at night isn't what happened. It's not knowing what would have happened if she hadn't woken up. Story 4. The Recording. In August of 2020, a man named Jeff Holt, 38 years old, a high school biology teacher from Boise, Idaho, took his 12-year-old son, Nate, on a father-son camping trip to the Sawtooth Wilderness. The Sawtooths are one of Idaho's most remote and rugged wilderness areas. Jagged granite peaks that rise over 10,000 feet, alpine lakes tucked into cirques carved by glaciers, and dense old-growth forest that stretches for miles in every direction. The area is home to mountain lions, wolves, black bears, and the occasional grizzly that wanders down from the north. It is serious backcountry. Jeff and Nate had been doing these trips since Nate was 8. It was their thing, the one tradition that was just theirs, separate from the rest of the family. Jeff's wife and their younger daughter weren't big on camping, so this was father-son time, and both of them looked forward to it all year. They hiked into a lake called Toxaway Lake, about 9 miles from the trailhead. It's a popular destination in the summer. The lake sits in a granite basin surrounded by towering peaks, and the water is so clear you can see the bottom at 20 feet. But Jeff had timed their trip for a Tuesday start, hoping to avoid the weekend crowds. It worked. When they arrived at the lake that afternoon, sweating under their packs, the entire basin was empty. No tents, no other hikers, just the lake and the mountains and the wind. They set up camp on a granite slab overlooking the water, surrounded by white bark pines that had been sculpted into twisted shapes by decades of wind. Jeff had brought a small handheld audio recorder, one of those digital ones about the size of a cigarette lighter, made by Zoom. He liked to record ambient nature sounds on their camping trips. It had started as a whim. He'd recorded a thunderstorm on one of their early trips and liked the way it sounded through headphones, and had turned into a hobby. He had a whole library of recordings on his laptop at home. Rainstorms on tent fabric, wind through canyon walls, bird calls at dawn, the crack of ice on an alpine lake in the early morning. He kept them organized by location and date. Nate thought it was nerdy. He ribbed his dad about it constantly, but Jeff didn't care. There was something about being able to put on headphones months later and be transported back to a specific place, a specific night, a specific moment. It was his thing. That night, after they'd eaten dinner, mac and cheese cooked on the camp stove, the backcountry staple, and Nate had fallen asleep in the tent around 9, Jeff sat outside for a while by himself. The sky was clear, and the Milky Way stretched overhead in a band so bright it cast faint shadows on the rocks. He sat on the granite and watched satellites track across the sky. It was one of those moments that made every mile of hiking and every ounce of pack weight worth it. Before he turned in, he pressed record on his audio device, set it on a flat rock about 10 feet from the tent's front door, and pointed the microphone toward the lake. He wanted to capture the sound of the water at night, the gentle lapping against the rocky shore, the wind moving through the basin, maybe the call of a great horned owl if he was lucky. He checked the battery, full, and the available storage, plenty. Then he crawled into the tent, zipped up, and went to sleep. The night passed without incident. Jeff and Nate both slept well. The exhaustion from the 9-mile hike took care of that. Nate woke up once to use the bathroom and came back complaining about how cold it was. Jeff didn't wake up at all. In the morning, they ate oatmeal, packed up camp, and hiked to the next lake on their route. Jeff retrieved the recorder, switched it off, and stuck it in the top pocket of his pack without a second thought. He didn't listen to it. He never listened to the recordings in the field. That was a project for when he got home. They spent 2 more days in the Sawtooths, camping at 2 more lakes, and hiked out on Friday morning. Great trip. No issues. That Sunday evening, after the gear was cleaned and put away, Jeff sat down at his desk in the spare bedroom he used as an office, plugged the recorder into his laptop with a USB cable, and started listening to the Toxaway Lake file. He opened it in Audacity, a free audio editing program, so he could see the waveform as well as hear the sound. He put on his good headphones, the over-ear ones that blocked out ambient noise, and pressed play. For the first hour and a half, it was exactly what he expected. Water sounds, wind, the occasional crack of a branch as a tree shifted, a few unidentified animal calls, probably pikas, the small mammals that live in the rock fields at high elevation. Peaceful stuff. Jeff was half listening, scrolling through emails on his phone, considering whether to trim the file down or keep the whole thing. Then, at roughly the 1 hour and 47-minute mark, something changed. There was a sound. Faint at first, almost lost in the ambient noise. He almost missed it, but something made him set down his phone and pay attention. Breathing. Not animal breathing. Not the quick, shallow panting of a deer or the snuffling of a bear. This was measured, controlled human breathing. Slow inhales through the nose. Long, steady exhales, and it was close to the recorder. Very close. Within a few feet. Whoever was breathing was standing right next to the rock where Jeff had placed the device. Jeff sat up in his chair. He rewound the file 30 seconds and listened again. There it was. Clear as anything. A person, breathing slowly and calmly, standing feet from the tent where he and his 12-year-old son were sleeping. He turned up the volume and kept listening. The breathing continued for about 3 minutes, just breathing. No footsteps, no rustling, no other sounds of movement. Whoever this was had approached the camp silently enough that the recorder hadn't picked up their arrival. They were just there, suddenly, breathing. Then there was a soft sound, fabric rustling, or maybe clothing brushing against itself, the kind of sound you hear when someone shifts their arms or adjusts their jacket. And the breathing moved. It got slightly quieter, as if whoever was breathing had shifted position, maybe taken a step or two back from the recorder. Then the whispering started. It was barely audible. Even with the volume turned up and the good headphones on, Jeff had to strain to make it out. A human voice, whispering. One voice, not a conversation, a monologue, a continuous unbroken stream of whispered words. Jeff couldn't make out individual words, no matter how many times he replayed the section. The volume was too low, and the lake sounds and wind kept interfering. But the rhythm of it was clear. It was speech, sentences. Flowing, continuous, rapid speech delivered in a whisper, without pause, without inflection, without emotion. Just a steady, quiet flow of words that went on and on and on. Jeff's hands were shaking. He paused the playback and sat there for a minute, staring at the waveform on his screen. Then he checked the timestamp. The whispering had started at 2:14 in the morning. He pressed play again. The whispering continued. It did not stop. It did not pause. There was no break for breath that Jeff could detect, which he said shouldn't be possible. A person has to breathe, has to pause between sentences, has to swallow. But the audio showed a continuous, unbroken stream of whispering for 23 minutes straight. From 2:14 to 2:37 in the morning. 23 minutes of non-stop whispering, right next to the recorder, right next to the tent where Jeff and his 12-year-old son were sleeping. Jeff listened to the entire 23 minutes. He said it was one of the hardest things he'd ever done. Not because it was loud or dramatic. It wasn't. It was the opposite. It was quiet and steady and relentless. And it was clearly a person, standing in the dark, in a remote wilderness basin at 2 in the morning, whispering to no one, or whispering to them. At the 2:37 mark, the whispering stopped. Same way the voices in the Smokies story stopped. A hard cut. One moment it was there, the next it was gone. There was a brief silence, about 15 seconds of just lake sounds and wind. Then came a sound that Jeff described as the worst part of the entire recording. The part that made him rip his headphones off the first time he heard it, and sit at his desk with his heart hammering. 3 slow, soft taps. Not on rock, not on wood, on nylon, on the tent. 3 taps on the wall of the tent, spaced about 2 seconds apart. Tap, tap, tap. Gentle, almost polite. The way you'd tap on someone's bedroom door to see if they were awake. Then nothing. The rest of the recording, another 4 hours, was just lake sounds and wind. Whoever had been there was gone. Jeff played the recording for his wife Sarah that night, after the kids were in bed. He watched her face as she listened. She went pale. She told him to delete it. He didn't. He made 2 copies, one on a flash drive that he put in his desk drawer, and one uploaded to a cloud storage account. He also filed a report with the Sawtooth National Forest Ranger Station the following Monday. He drove the 45 minutes to the station in person rather than calling. The ranger he spoke to, a young woman, probably late 20s, listened to the relevant portion of the recording on Jeff's phone. She didn't say much while it played. When it was done, she asked Jeff a series of questions, exactly where they'd camped, exactly when, whether they'd seen anyone else on the trail, whether anything at camp had been disturbed. Jeff answered everything. Then the ranger told him something that made his skin crawl. She said they'd had a handful of similar reports over the past few years. Hikers in the Sawtooth Wilderness describing the feeling of being watched at night, finding footprints near their camp in the morning that they couldn't account for. One couple had reported hearing someone walking circles around their tent for over an hour. Another solo hiker had woken up to find that his boots, which he'd left outside his tent door, had been moved about 20 feet away and placed neatly side by side, facing the trail back to the trailhead, as if someone was telling him to leave. None of the reports had resulted in an arrest. None had resulted in a confirmed identification of whoever was out there. The ranger said they'd increased patrols in the area, but that the Sawtooth Wilderness is over 217,000 acres, and they had a staff of 12. Jeff and Nate still go camping together every August. It's still their tradition. But Jeff no longer leaves the audio recorder running at night. He said he realized, sitting at his desk that Sunday evening, listening to 23 minutes of whispering, that there are things happening in the dark that you're better off not knowing about. He said the wilderness at night belongs to something else, and he'd rather not have proof of what that something is. Story 5. The Cabin That Wasn't on the Map. This final story takes place in West Virginia, in the Monongahela National Forest, in November of 2017. Two friends, Patrick Lowe and Eric Vaughn, both 33, had planned a 3-day backpacking trip along a section of the Allegheny Trail. Both men were from Charleston, West Virginia. Both were experienced hikers who'd been exploring the state's backcountry since their early 20s. And both had a particular love for late-season trips, November, even early December. When the trails were empty, the leaves were down, the underbrush had died back, and the mountains felt like they belonged to no one. There's a different quality to the Appalachian woods in late autumn. The canopy is gone, so you can see farther through the forest than at any other time of year. The silence is heavier. The colors are muted, grays and browns, and the dark green of the occasional hemlock. The days are short. The nights are long and cold. Most people don't want to be out there in November. Patrick and Eric loved it. They started on a Thursday morning from a trailhead near Durban, a tiny town in the eastern part of the state. The temperature was in the low 30s. Their breath made clouds. The trees were bare except for the oaks, which hold their dead brown leaves through winter with a sound that's distinct. A dry, papery rustling in the wind that sounds nothing else in the forest. A light mist hung in the valleys below them, filling the hollows with white, making the ridgetops look like islands floating in a sea of clouds. It was beautiful and stark and lonesome. By mid-afternoon, they'd covered about 8 miles along the ridge, moving at a good pace on the well-maintained trail. The terrain was typical for the Allegheny Highlands, rolling ridgeline with steep terrain falling away on both sides into forested hollows and creek drainages. The soil was thin and rocky. The trees were mostly hardwoods, oak, maple, beech, hickory, their bare branches forming a lattice overhead through which the gray sky was visible in every direction. Around 3:30, with maybe an hour and a half of daylight left, they started looking seriously for a place to camp. Good flat camping spots were hard to come by on this section of trail. The ridge was narrow, and the ground on either side sloped away steeply. Every potential site they passed was either too slanted, too rocky, or too exposed to the wind that was now picking up from the west. They pushed on for another mile, hoping to find something suitable before they lost the light entirely. That's when Eric stopped walking and pointed downhill. About 200 yards below the trail, through the stripped bare hardwood forest, there was a structure. At first, Patrick thought it was a rock formation. The area had outcrops of sandstone and limestone that could look like buildings from a distance. But as they stood there squinting down the slope, they could see it clearly. It was a building, a small cabin, maybe 12 feet by 12 feet, built from rough-cut logs. It had a single door, no windows, and a roof made of corrugated metal that had gone nearly black with age and oxidation. It sat in a small, relatively flat area on the hillside, surrounded by hemlocks, one of the few evergreen species in the area, which partially concealed it from the trail. If the hardwoods had still had their leaves, they never would have seen it. Patrick checked his map, a USGS topographic map he'd bought specifically for this trip. There was nothing marked at this location. No shelter, no historical structure, no trail intersection, nothing. Eric pulled up the area on his GPS unit, which had the National Forest overlay loaded. Same thing, just blank forest. No symbol, No label, no indication that anything existed on that hillside. They looked at each other. They were both tired. They were both cold. The wind was picking up, and the temperature was going to drop into the 20s overnight. The prospect of sleeping inside an actual structure, even a crude windowless one, with a roof over their heads and walls to block the wind, was very appealing. They left the trail and picked their way down the slope, stepping over downed logs and pushing through mountain laurel thickets until they reached the cabin. Up close, the cabin was crude but solid. The logs were hand-hewn. You could see the axe marks, and fitted together with notched corners, chinked with what looked like a mixture of clay and moss. The metal roof was rusted but intact, with no visible holes. The door was made of thick wooden planks, reinforced with iron cross braces, and hung on hand-forged iron hinges. There was no lock, no latch, just a leather loop that served as a handle. Patrick pulled the leather loop and pushed. The door swung open heavily, scraping against the dirt threshold. Inside, the cabin was a single room. The floor was packed dirt, hard and dry. Against the far wall, there was a wooden platform, a sleeping shelf, basically, raised about 2 feet off the ground, wide enough for 2 or 3 people to lie side by side. It was built from the same rough-cut lumber as the cabin itself, and it was covered with a layer of dried pine boughs that someone had laid down in overlapping rows. In the corner, there was a small wood stove made from a 55-gallon steel drum, cut in half, with a hinged door welded on the front and a stovepipe running up through the roof. There was a stack of split firewood next to the stove, maybe a dozen pieces, cut to length and stacked neatly. On the opposite wall, there was a shelf made from a single plank of wood, and on it sat 3 items: a tin cup, a tin plate, and a folding knife with a wooden handle, the blade closed. Everything was covered in a fine layer of dust. The place smelled like damp earth and old wood and pine resin. But here's the thing that gave both men pause. It was clean. Not lived in clean, but maintained clean. No cobwebs in the corners. No leaves blown in through the door. No animal nests. No mouse droppings. No sign of rot or water damage. The stovepipe showed no rust on the interior. The firewood was dry and seasoned. The pine boughs on the sleeping shelf were not fresh, but they weren't crumbling either, maybe a few weeks old. Someone was taking care of this place. They just weren't here right now. Patrick and Eric debated. The smart thing, the thing any wilderness safety guide would tell you to do, was to move on, find a proper campsite, and stay on the trail. You don't sleep in structures you can't account for. You don't make yourself at home in someone else's building. But it was getting dark. It was cold. The wind was pushing hard through the bare trees, and the forecast had called for temperatures in the teens by morning, and the cabin had a wood stove and dry firewood and a sleeping shelf. They decided to stay, just one night. They gathered additional firewood from the surrounding forest, dead falls and standing dead wood that snapped cleanly. They got the stove going, and the dry wood caught quickly, filling the cabin with warmth and the smell of wood smoke. They cooked dinner on their camp stove inside the cabin, ramen with chunks of summer sausage, a backcountry classic, and ate sitting on the sleeping shelf, their backs against the log wall, their boots off for the first time in hours. By 7 o'clock, the cabin was comfortable, warm. The fire popped and ticked in the stove. The wind was audible outside but couldn't reach them. By 8, they were in their sleeping bags on the wooden platform, talking about the rest of the trip, debating whether to cut the route short and head out a day early so they could catch the WVU football game on Saturday. Normal stuff. The kind of conversation you have when everything is fine. Eric fell asleep around 9. Patrick lay awake for a while, watching the firelight flicker through the seams of the stove door, casting shifting orange shapes on the log walls. He listened to the fire and the wind. The wind had picked up. He could hear it roaring through the bare treetops above the cabin, a deep rushing sound. But inside, everything was still. Warm. Safe. He started to feel like staying here had been the right call. At some point, Patrick guesses it was around midnight, based on how long the fire had been burning down. He heard a sound that brought him fully and instantly awake. Not groggy, not confused, awake. 0 to alert in a fraction of a second. It was footsteps, on leaves, but not one set of footsteps, many. Multiple people, moving through the dry leaves in the forest duff, coming from downhill, from the direction of the hollow below the cabin, heading upward toward them. The sound was unmistakable, that crunching, shuffling rhythm of boots on dry autumn leaves, and there were a lot of feet making it. Patrick sat up and shook Eric's shoulder. Eric woke up fast. Some part of his brain must have already been on alert, because he didn't groan or ask what was happening. He just sat up and listened. The footsteps were getting closer. Then they stopped, right outside the cabin, close enough that Patrick and Eric could hear breathing through the log walls. Multiple people breathing. Standing just outside the door, inches from that heavy wooden slab, gathered in the darkness. The cabin had no windows. There was no way to see out. Patrick reached for his headlamp, which was sitting on the shelf next to the stove. Eric grabbed his arm and shook his head. The meaning was clear. Don't turn it on. Don't let them know we're awake. For several minutes, 4, maybe 5, though it felt much longer. There was no sound except that breathing. Multiple people, standing outside the door, breathing. Not talking, not moving. Just standing there. Then someone knocked on the door. 3 knocks, firm but not aggressive, not pounding, not kicking. The kind of knock you'd use on a neighbor's front door in the middle of the afternoon. Polite, measured. That's what made it so terrifying. The normalcy of it. The calmness. Neither Patrick nor Eric responded. They sat on that sleeping shelf, shoulder to shoulder, staring at the door in the near total darkness. The fire in the stove had burned down to coals, giving off just enough dim orange glow to see the outline of the door. A full minute passed. Patrick counted the seconds in his head. 60 seconds of silence. Then the knocking came again. 3 knocks. Same rhythm, same force. 1, 2, 3. And then a voice. A man's voice. Calm, even, almost friendly. The way you'd talk to someone you knew. Said, "We know you're in there. We saw your smoke." Patrick's throat went dry. His heart was hammering so hard he was sure whoever was outside could hear it. He looked at Eric. In the faint orange glow of the dying coals, Eric's face was white. He was already reaching for the camp knife he kept clipped to the side pocket of his pack. Patrick wanted to respond. Part of him wanted to say something, to establish some kind of communication, to figure out who these people were, to make this situation make sense. But another part of him, a deeper part, the part that had kept human beings alive for 100,000 years, said no. Don't engage. Don't let them hear your voice. Don't give them anything. The voice spoke again, still calm, still measured, still with that casual, almost neighborly tone. You should come outside. They did not respond. They did not move. They barely breathed. What happened next was the part that Patrick says he replays in his head more than anything else. The footsteps started again, but they didn't leave. They circled the cabin, slowly. Patrick and Eric could track the sound, multiple sets of feet, moving around the exterior of the structure, crunching through the dry leaves. They started at the door, moved to the left wall, paused, then continued to the back wall, paused again, then to the right wall, another pause, then back to the front, back to the door. Each time they paused, the pause lasted about 10 seconds, as if whoever was out there was stopping at each wall to listen, or to look for a way in, or to count the walls, or something else entirely that Patrick and Eric couldn't fathom. The circuit took about 2 minutes. Then the footsteps returned to the front of the cabin and stopped, right at the door again. The same voice, one more time. "This is our place, you need to leave." Our place. Not my place. Our place. As in the group of people currently standing outside in the dark. The people who built this cabin, or maintained it, or used it. The people who had left that firewood, and that tin cup, and that folding knife. The people who knew this building existed, even though it appeared on no map, in no database, in no record of any kind. Eric finally spoke. His voice cracked when he did it. The first syllable came out almost squeaking before he got control of it. But he said, as steadily as he could, "We're armed. We're not coming out. We'll leave at first light." It was a bluff. They had a camp knife and a small hatchet for splitting kindling. That was it. No gun, no bear spray, nothing that would stop a determined person, let alone a group. Silence. A long one. 30 seconds. A minute. Then the footsteps started again, but this time, they were moving away. Downhill, back the way they'd come. Multiple sets of feet, crunching through the dead leaves, getting quieter and quieter and quieter until they disappeared entirely into the forest below. Patrick and Eric did not go back to sleep. They sat on that wooden platform with the knife and the hatchet, one of them watching the door while the other watched the stovepipe hole in the roof, the only other opening in the structure. They didn't talk. They didn't move. They sat and listened and waited for the rest of the night. Every creak of the cabin settling, every gust of wind, every snap of a branch in the forest sent a spike of adrenaline through both of them. Nobody came back. At 5:45 in the morning, the first gray light started filtering through the gap under the door. A thin line of cold dawn. They packed in under 3 minutes. Sleeping bags stuffed, not rolled. Stove left as it was. They opened the door. The morning air hit them, cold and sharp. The mist was thick in the hollow below, but the area around the cabin was clear, and it was covered in footprints. The dry leaf litter had been churned and scattered by multiple sets of feet circling the structure. On the patches of exposed dirt near the doorway, the prints were clearer. Heavy boots, multiple sizes. Patrick crouched down and tried to count distinct sets based on shoe size and tread pattern. He stopped at 6. There had been at least 6 people standing outside that cabin in the middle of the night, in the middle of a national forest, miles from the nearest road, on a hillside that doesn't appear on any map. They didn't linger. They climbed back up to the trail and hiked out at a pace that had them both soaked in sweat despite the freezing temperature. They covered the 8 miles back to the trailhead in under 3 hours. The entire way, neither of them saw another person. Not one. When they got home, Patrick tried to research the cabin. He spent hours online, searching historical records, Forest Service databases, the National Register of Historic Places, West Virginia Division of Culture and History archives, old land surveys. Nothing. The cabin didn't exist, as far as any official record was concerned. He contacted the Monongahela National Forest Office directly. The woman he spoke to on the phone said she wasn't aware of any structure in that area. She said there were sometimes illegal structures built deep in the forest by various groups. People growing marijuana, survivalist groups, people who had decided to live outside the system, people who had their own reasons for being out there and very much did not want company. She asked Patrick for the GPS coordinates of the cabin. He gave them. She was quiet for a moment. Then she told Patrick and Eric that they were lucky. She said that word specifically, lucky. Patrick asked her what she meant. She said she couldn't elaborate, but repeated that they should consider themselves fortunate that the encounter ended the way it did. She recommended that if they hiked that section of trail again, they stay on the trail and not investigate any structures they might see from the ridgeline. Patrick and Eric still hike together. They still do late-season trips in the Appalachian backcountry, but they stay on the trail now. They carry a satellite communicator, and when they see something in the woods that doesn't belong, a structure, a clearing, a path that isn't on the map, they keep walking. They don't stop. They don't investigate. They learned that lesson in a 12-by-12 windowless cabin on a hillside in Monongahela, listening to 6 sets of footsteps circle in the dark. And those were 5 true disturbing encounters people had while camping in the wilderness. 5 groups of people who went out into nature looking for peace and quiet and found something waiting for them instead. People who heard footsteps in the dark and breathing that wasn't their own, and voices that said things they couldn't understand. People who found handprints on their tents and boot prints in the dirt and stone circles they couldn't explain. If you take anything from these stories, let it be this. The wilderness is not empty. It never has been, And sometimes the things out there in the dark know you're there long before you know about them. If you enjoyed these stories, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on all notifications. If you haven't already, check out the podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. If you have your own camping horror story, something that happened to you out in the woods that you've never been able to explain, put it down in the comments or send it in to justcreepy.net. And who knows, your story might end up in a future video. Until next time, stay safe out there.